Beyond Black Mirror. Social media.
Brooker has frequently professed a fascination with social media in interviews. He admits to being especially interested in Twitter, which is a platform that he regularly engages with. It makes sense that with his own personal curiosity in social media and the prevalence of it in our lives, that his work should contain references to it. However, like all technological advancements, Black Mirror takes the platforms to their darkest extremes possible, which leads to the show exposing the shady underbelly of the online world across several episodes in the series. Hated in the Nation shows an audience what it is like to be at the centre of a Twitter storm, something Brooker has first-hand knowledge of, having been at the end of an online backlash before, something which he cites as the inspiration for the episode. The episode likens being the subject of online abuse to a bee which burrows into your brain, causing so much pain that killing yourself becomes preferable to enduring it. Each day these bees have their target selected by the internet mob, who decide who will die via a vote. By using the hashtag #Death2 with someone's name, they are selecting who will be the next victim of the swarm. The real antagonist of the piece is not the hacker who has hijacked the artificial bees of a futuristic British Isles, but those who engage in the Twitter witch hunt, which becomes a daily game of life and death. In the ending frame, we are shown the consequence of those who have engaged in the online activities, where there is finally recompense for their actions. The piece goes further to suggest that those who are involving themselves in jumping on the dog pile of online abuse behave in a similar manner to a swarm, mindlessly following others with no real explanation for their behaviour. One character even states that she wrote her Death2 tweet without knowing where the name came from. Wishing death on another with such frivolity, it likens the behaviour of the online mob to the characters taking part in the 2 Minutes of Hate in George Orwell's 1984. In the novel, the populace are told to throw their ill feeling at a figure, and do so with complete obedience without questioning why they are doing it. A totalitarian vision if there ever was one. One of the more striking scenes is during the opening, where we are introduced to our protagonists in the car as they debate the significance of the smartphone, which now seems to be a constant presence in our palms. Although one notes that they are separate objects from us, we increasingly see them as a gateway to another self that we project in an online space. A virtual representation of us, which although is intertwined with our physical being, we feel comfortable that we are safe from any ramifications of our actions. However, it is evident that our character thinks that this is now in the process of changing, and the space between our created virtual world and the physical one is shrinking. Although another episode, the national anthem, made headlines for other reasons, it is also another episode from which the series critiques social media in the modern world. During the narrative, the Prime Minister of England must have sex with a pig live on national TV. Initially, the mainstream media in the narrative struggles with how they should report on such a sensitive story, eventually being gagged by the PM's office so they are unable to. However, eventually their hand is forced as the story is being spread across social media. With the country talking about little else, the event has to be reflected in the news, and the mainstream media run the story due to their duty to report on issues that are within the public discourse. It is hard not to watch this episode and think about the super injunctions which have been in the process of moving through the courts at the time of the episode's broadcast. In this we see how the digital world that we have now become natives of is an unwieldy and problematic space, as it is currently not governed by a set of coherent rules, and is far quicker to react to events than more traditional media outlets, and much more difficult to control. It gives us a frightening insight into the speed at which information can now travel, and possibly showcases that more archaic laws governing communication need to be updated, or are possibly no longer relevant in the modern world. Nosedive shows us another frightening side of human interaction with social media. In 2014, humblebrag was entered into the Oxford English Dictionary. The need for such a term shows a society obsessed with our online personas and judging our worth based on the interaction that we have with one another in this virtual space. Nosedive takes this to the extreme, where within the narrative we are introduced to a class system which is based on the number of stars you have accumulated from your social media profile that have been earned through interactions with others on an Instagram-like app. For many, social media is a place to present an idealised version of themselves, which becomes a false representation of who they really are. This is heightened in the episode by Joe Wright's direction, deciding to set the piece in a town reminiscent of the Stepford Wives, which uses the trope of the body snatcher to critique the rather sinister aesthetic of perfect suburban living, and possibly goes further to critique the Insta lifestyles that this episode takes aim at by making everything appear to be filtered. Our protagonist, Lacey, comes to embody the idea of the hedonic treadmill, a concept modified by Michael Eisnick to its current form in the late 1990s. The notion of this theory is that we are unable to be content because we are constantly chasing the next thing which will make us happier than we are at that moment. This ensures that we are always left dissatisfied with what we have. Social media platforms contribute heavily to this in the modern world by constantly filling our timelines with unending things to be jealous of, and have us constantly trying to keep ourselves strapped into our own hedonic treadmill, if only to project a life that is worth showcasing to the rest of the world. It is telling that the only time in the episode where we see that Lacey is truly able to be content is when she is confined away from social media in a jail cell and is able to drop the pretense that she has to be nice to everyone in the hope of rising up the social rankings. In getting off her treadmill, she's finally able to be content. The theme of real and represented persona is explored in more detail in the episode Be Right Back, where a grieving widow brings her husband back from the dead using his social media and email accounts to reconstruct his personality inside a robot replica of him. The episode draws reference from tales such as Frankenstein's monster and the myth of Tithonus and Eos, where the god Eos begged Zeus to make her lover Tithonus immortal. However, she forgot to request that he be made young forever. As the myth goes, old age pressed full upon him, and he could not move nor lift his limbs. This seemed to her in her heart to be best counsel. She laid him in a room and put to the shining doors. There he babbles endlessly, and no more has strength at all, such as once he had in his supple limbs. In Be Right Back, the utopian vision of the potential of eternal life which our social media profiles promise becomes a dystopian nightmare. The version of Ash which rises from the dead is not the one that his wife wants to remember. Rather, he is constructed from the idealised version of himself which he presented to the world in the online space. After death, Ash is now simply a simulation of what he was in real life. It is telling that even Jean Baudrillard, one of the fathers of postmodern thinking, when asked about his own obituary stated, "What I am now, I don't know. I am the simulacra of myself." It is also of interest to note the language that the characters use to discuss Ash's use of social media. At the funeral, it is suggested that Ash is addicted to social media. One guest even states that he was a heavy user. This brings to mind that social media is akin to a drug rather than a simple communication platform. It is even suggested that it might have been the thing which ultimately led to his death, with him being unable to tear himself away from his phone whilst driving. The entire history of you is one of the more frightening allegories of social media that the series has produced. Although arguably a piece which rails against the invasion of surveillance into our lives by presenting a vision of a world totally policed by the Hawthorne effect, as everyone has a grain implanted which turns their eyes into a camera, it also has some interesting things to say about our modern obsession with social media. In the episode, the grain which characters have fitted into their eyes allows them to recall memories at the push of a button. As in the real world, where we are able to scroll through timelines and analyse our lives in detail, characters in the entire history of you are able to experience redos, something that our protagonist has become fixated on, which have made him paranoid and depressed. The aesthetics of the episode reinforce this idea, with the past our character remembers bathed in a bright glow, whereas in the present, the colour is washed out and greys and blues dominate the frame. This ability to be constantly absent from reality and involved within the digital recreation of the past even pervades into sexual intimacy in the bedroom, with the couple using the grain to remember other sexual encounters whilst lying together in bed in an almost masturbatory state. It appears that there is no facet of life that has not been disrupted by this technology, with individuals now rather wishing to be consumed in an idealised past, rather than present in the here and now. At the end of the episode, our protagonist decides he can no longer live with his grain, and removes it from behind his ear. However, rather than being a mark that he has learnt from his journey and has finally decided that this is the cause of all his ills, it could be read as more of an action which is to cut out the memories that he has of his now ex-wife. Simply one last attempt to spite her. All of the Black Mirror episodes that deal directly with social media seem to end on a similar message, suggesting that we need to cut social media out of our lives, or at least use them in a more responsible manner, else face the frightening reality that we have to live with them all of the time. Staring into a black mirror.